Thank you very much, Sandy. I was very pleased when Sandy and David asked if I would do this. They asked if I would talk about the calculus of consent in context. So I was pleased to do this because if I might be allowed a minute side excursion, it was the very book that sent me to the University of Virginia back in 1963, because you all may not believe it now, I don't believe it now, but back when I was an undergraduate student, I was fairly competent in math. In my last year as an undergraduate, the 62-63 school year, a fellow from Virginia had just moved there, Richard Bilas, and he was teaching a graduate course in math econ. And I had courses I needed, so I took his class and did well. And we were talking about graduate school, what I was going to do with the rest of my life, because I was a natural bookworm anyway. And I said, I don't know. I'm kind of debating between economics and political science, but I really like the stuff they talk about in political science more. It just grabs me better. But I like the way economists reason and think. You don't have to guess what faculty members are thinking so much. You can figure it out and go from there logically. And Dick said, I have just the solution for you. Calculus of Consent had just been published a few months before. And I read that, and it was as if my whole future was set in stone almost right at that moment. And so I was very pleased to be asked to talk about the calculus of consent in the context. And as I started thinking about it, working on it, starting to write some things, of course, for me, many of you who are students around here know that I don't believe you think without writing, and the two just run together. And when I started thinking context, I think my mind was thinking in terms of some freeze frame snapshot of a state at some instant about the time the book was written or published. But then as I started thinking about this more and digging into it more, I realized that this was making a transition into some kind of dramatic enterprise of some type, some kind of story that had a beginning, and it had a middle, of course, and then it had an end. And moreover, it was an end that was a sad end, a story that opened up initially in fond hopes and dreams and aspirations, and then came to a thud, a bad ending for the participants. But I didn't want, because I like those old ancient Greek dramatists, I didn't want the end to be just a bad guy outgunned them. But I wanted that end to include some frailties from the characters who were participating in the creation of that drama, because I firmly believe that the patterns of thought we adopt to think about things have the ability to grab a hold of us and to extend and influence our various conduct. And so it's that I think our models and our formulations have that two-edged quality about them. And I think there are some things then in the calculus of consent that may contribute to the downfall of the program. At least that's the kind of dramatic, thematic, I shouldn't call it drama, but that's the kind of thematic scheme that I found myself developing as I got more and more into this. And so as a result, that led to this change of title that, you remember the first version that was sent out had the top title. Then when I submitted my paper, it changed to this bottom title, The Irony of the Calculus of Consent, Diaspora for a Budding Research Program. So this is going to be the order of the presentation, the order of the paper. You know, I have to start off with the beginning, so section 1 is the beginning. A few remarks about the beginning, not many, but a few. And then, which is where I originally began, was in 1962 as a portrait of the calculus of consent as a reflection of the Virginia program in full flower. And so what there is number 2 is what I originally thought was going to be the entire presentation of the calculus of consent in context. Became now just one of 6 sections. And so then, as thinking about this, all of a sudden, I found myself thinking, well, why did this happen in Charlottesville? Why didn't it happen at UCLA or Chicago? Because if you say in terms of programs at that time that were very strongly associated with classical liberalism and economics, those would be the three. So I have this thing I call interlude. Why Virginia, not UCLA and Chicago? Where I offer a few speculations because I couldn't resist doing so. Material just almost commanded me to say something about it. But then, from there, this fourth section, and going back to 1958, near the beginning, I wanted to say something about public principles of public debt because I think the book has been very much underestimated and misinterpreted, as it were. And as a confession to a labor-saving device, Roger Collins, of course, is organizing this program in Buchanan in late September, and he asked me to give a presentation on Buchanan and public debt. And I don't just want to summarize Buchanan and public debt, so I need to do something different. So that is where this came about. In a way, that's putting the public principles of public debt in a bigger context that nonetheless points to the very unique qualities, I think, of the Virginia program of political economy. And so then the fifth is kind of a carrying forward that though the program in Charlottesville didn't stay around, the idea of Virginia political economy certainly has, and looking forward, I have this section on challenges and opportunities. And then I want to close with a bit of irony. That's this final turn of the plot, and that's where I want to bring in someone I was aware of a long time ago but never read, a fellow named Carl Schmitt and his view of the political, and I want to bring some things up there in the end. So, how do I do this? Wait a minute. I'm used to up and down and not right and left. But David didn't actually read these quotes in the presentation, but he had the page up there. And this is where I began, as Virginia Political Economy as a liberal research program, the founding, and those two come from this secret report that they're going to look into more at the UVA archives. It says, on the one hand, it is generally recognized that at the top professional levels, this department is staffed by unquestionably capable men, and that it enjoys a considerable repute in the profession. And then that's followed by the statement, we have been given to understand that the repute enjoyed is regarded by the vast majority of economists as of a distinctly unfavorable character. And that sets the scene. That report from the table would have been compiled in early 1963 or mid-1963, which means it had probably been underway for a year or so in various ways. And who actually wrote it, we don't know. Maybe we will before too long now. But I think the thesis, and of course I want to put in terms of this drama, is to set up the Virginia political economy stood, or you might say, athwart a kind of progressivist-dominated research program that was the very core of the founding of the American Economic Association, and I think dominates the American Economic Association to this very day. And so, with that, then I would say the program really began in 1956. I want to jump ahead to 1962, which is the midpoint, because I think 1962, you might say, gives a momentary glimpse of what perhaps might have been the full potential, not the full potential, but a very dramatic expression of the potential of Virginia political economy in terms of the kinds of work and research that was going on, these styles of thinking. And so I do that. And in terms of looking basically at three people, but I'll also mention a couple of others. First, Warren Nutter on Soviet growth. his growth of industrial production in the Soviet Union, I think, had two kinds of themes about it. One was the use, whether through CIA or other sources, of Soviet statistics that weren't at all to be believed. And number two, and I think more significantly for what it says to Virginia political economy, is that the Western economists who worked with Soviet growth statistics did some very peculiar picking and selecting. They put out years of famine, years of war, et cetera, et cetera. Those were abnormal years. Nutter said no. Those were not abnormal years. They might have been abnormal years for a liberally organized society, but they were not abnormal years for a collectively organized society. That's what you should expect to get from a collectively organized society. Lots of bloodied noses, chopped off heads, gulags. Those were part of what the system had to have to operate. And so do not throw away what is reflective of the system of social order that you're talking about. And so what Nutter then was very much engaged in, didn't express it this way, was a kind of comparative systems approach of a basically liberally organized economy, dominantly organized through private transactions, private ordering, with one of a collectively organized, politically dominated society, and said, well, let's compare the systemic properties of the two, and that's what Nutter, that's why you had Nutter bringing in all the bad years that most of the Western economists would throw out in trying to do their projections. And Nutter had some of these tables that showed the Soviet Union might catch up by 25 and stuff like that in the back of the book. So, see, that systemic approach, rather than looking at particular instances that was characteristic of Nutter, I think in the text, for instance, I even sweep Jane Jacobs into Virginia political economy because her systems of survival is a very beautiful example of trying to think about how various systems and what the performance properties might be. And when you talk about performance properties, I also in the text sweep in Rutledge Vining, who David has talked about earlier, because the entire thrust of Vining's work was really on trying to think in terms of populations of interacting agents before that kind of terminology was in place. That he was deeply concerned with characterizing societies in terms of various kinds of distributions, refusing to reduce societies to averages and stuff like that, thinking that outliers in various ways did very important kind of work. And so that comparative systems kind of thing that we're thinking about, different systems within which people live together in close proximity. And there can be different ways in which that living together in close proximity can play out. And was there in Nutter, there in Vining, there in the remaining people I'm going to talk about, Leland Yeager. Over the 1960-61 school year, sponsored a series of presentations that led to the book published in 1962, In Search of a Monetary Constitution. Now there were all the people that were prominent at the time, some are still remembered. Probably the ones who are still probably most strongly remembered from that time would be Jacob Viner, Milton Friedman, and James Buchanan. Well, I guess Murray Rothbard too. And there's some others, but they were all prominent at their time. And while, as you would expect, 15 or so prominent people, there were differences among them, for sure. But at the same time, there was also some very deep commonalities, basically in terms of the idea of money as being part of the background framework of stable rules within which people can conduct their economic activities. And so that also reflected very much this classical liberal program that you look at the American constitutional system and where does money appear, monetary powers appear, the clause and weights and measures and stuff like that, and which fits in then with an idea that originally the dollar was defined as simply a 20th of an ounce of gold or something to that effect of a certain fineness. And that kind of and so the various contributors to that were all, came at it from different angles, but all sharing this presumption that monetary stability was one of the vital components of a framework of stable rules, within which, if that framework was stable, people could conduct their affairs and organize their activities pretty well. But when that framework becomes flexible, variable, then these problems become worse. And of course, the Employment Act of 1946, I might add, flew directly in the face of this, and you might say was surely unconstitutional if you compared the Employment Act of 46 with what it implied with what the Weights and Measures Clause of the Constitution implied, because what it meant was monetary policy became counterfeiting. In that, if you say that within the basic constitutional understanding, that where was public ordering in that clause? Well, it was in the prevention of counterfeiting. And so the police power would be what monetary policy was, which, is a different notion from monetary policy today. And so there again, you have a systematic presentation of a body of work that stands very much athwart the progressivist program of the political domination of society. And then we come to Buchanan and Tulloch and the calculus of consent. Woodrow Wilson, of course, was an arch progressivist. Before he became president, long before, he was professor of political economy, political science, actually. He wrote a book titles in the paper, something about representative government or something like that. Congressional government, 1885 or somewhere in there. And it was a vitriolic attack on the American constitutional complexity, that he wanted straight lines of command and support ruled by the best. And which, of course, was this idea of rule by elites was a common mantra throughout the progressivist period. And so the calculus of consent point of view there was that the American constitutional founding could be rendered sensible by a deep kind of economizing logic, that a logic that was later adumbrated by Vincent Ostrom in his political theory of the Compound Republic, where the claim was that basically, this was an Ostrom theme here, was in terms of language, was that government always involved a kind of a Faustian bargain, of one where you're countenancing the use of instruments of evil, hoping that you'll get more good than evil coming out, but you're going to get both. And what the mixture of good and evil is, or likely to be, is going to depend upon the constitutional rules of the game. And this is where Rutledge Vining comes back into the picture again, although these were more in talks I had with him than anything else. If you ever try to read Vining, it's not an easy job. Dave and I were talking about this earlier. But in that kind of framework, the basic, again, Vining came from a statistical background, economics, but he was big into statistics. And within the context of statistical decision theory, there is no perfection possible in terms of making judgments. The famous problem that I remember Vining used, he worked through Jersey Neyman's probability theory book that had about 80 pages on the lady tasting tea. This is the story of a lady claims she can tell in a cup of tea whether you put the milk in first or you put the tea in first. And what Neyman worked through in about 80 pages were different statistical procedures and testing procedures by which and what the properties were of different procedures in terms of the two types of errors that you could make, where you would say on the one hand, she can't tell the difference, but she could. Or you say the reverse. And so it was that kind of framework then mapped into the idea of, there you have a statistical decision framework for coming up with judgments. But then if you transplant that into a legislative system and so forth, how do different kinds of constitutional procedures map into this district decision framework? It was very much something that was alive and being discussed around there. And that one, the sort of ideal progressivist approach with that would say, well, you get the right expert, and then everything will be fine. What the calculus consent approach said was, well, what the American arrangements did was create a kind of a division of authority and powers, complex arrangements, separation of powers, so that outcomes are more likely to reflect some kind of concurrence amongst differently situated people, and that's more likely to give outcomes that reflect what you might call, I don't want to say general will, that's a bad term, but might reflect some widespread concurrence among people as against what might reflect some particular desires of certain kinds of empowered elites. And so that was the kind of the research climate, research culture that was in play in Virginia, certainly when I went there in the fall of 1963. And so it was very much a program, it was a scientific program predicated on, harkening back to classical liberal visions. And I should say that all of these characters, all of them, had a deep reverence for Frank Knight. Buchanan, of course, and Nutter and Vining all had classes from Knight directly in Chicago. Yeager didn't, but Yeager had the same reverence for Knight as well, as did Coase. And so did Coase. I mean, we say something about Coase. Oh, I'm going to probably have to take him out of the paper. I'll explain why in a minute. But Coase one time said that, there are some smart people in this profession, that while they're smart, I don't feel in any sense awed by them. Like, take Hayek, he said. I can imagine writing things like what Hayek wrote. But when it comes to Frank Knight, I can't imagine that. Now, he said that in a warm way. That wasn't that, damn, what does he say? Which I've sometimes thought. But it was in a way that said, boy, this guy is just going down deeper. And I admire that depth, because Coase was not a shallow man, for sure. And but so Knight had that presence everywhere throughout the program. And that I put in Coase in this 1962. I have Coase down here, but in the David and Sandy's documentation, Coase has this one letter that says, send off a reprint, and it was dated 1961. Now, what I know and what I put in the paper was the Journal of Law and Economics was always running late back in those days. And I remember it was about 2 years late. And it didn't get on time until Coase moved there and became editor. And so, you know how you can get wrapped up in the moment. And so I was pounding away, organizing these sessions. I said, Coase is missing. I don't want to leave Coase out. I had my first year in history thought for 2 classes. I don't want to leave him out. I like the guy a lot. I didn't want to leave him out. So I had to bring him in. I thought, Journal of Law and Economics. It wasn't published in 1960. It came later. And I thought, remember, yeah, it was about 2 years later. So I put Coase, because also then that fit in with Buchanan and Stubblebine. Because the Buchanan and Stubblebine 62 piece has the same kind of thematic about the ability of people within a regime of private ordering to work out complex transactional arrangements that will overcome various kinds of often collectively recognized problems that people face if they have the ability to do so. And so I thought that, well, this again fits into the scheme of things, but I was wedded to the 1962 retrospective. I could have put in CA 1962 and I would have covered myself well, but anyway, that's something I need to do a bit more digging in, but That might be perhaps a bridge too far, you might say, that I took in this case, but I'll think about that some more. Then to the interlude. After setting up the Virginia political economy as a really thoroughgoing classical liberal program that was very self-consciously, I think, something that stood athwart the progressivist domination of not just the American Economic Association, but social sciences in general, I found myself unavoidably asking, well, why did UCLA and Chicago not have similar fates? What was there different? And I don't know how to answer that question fully. I put in the paper, I just put like 3 pages of kind of a sidebar remark, thinking, well, if you're going to try to explain that, I think I made a distinction between what you might call internal sources of explanation and external. What I mean by internal are things that reside within the professional discipline. By external, I mean things that connect that discipline to its university setting in which it operates and exists. And that's where I think this Charlottesville, Edgar Shannon's letter and all that, his support or not, I think are so important, because, say, as an internal matter, I'm kind of skeptical that anything about Virginia-style economics at the time would cause it any kind of professional problem of any kind of dramatic type, because all economics programs have places for markets. I mean, without markets, there's no economics. The only question in play is whether markets are subject to thoroughgoing political control, or whether basically it's a matter of foreground and background. Whether the foreground is political domination that says what are the objects of contract, the terms of contract, and so forth, or whether people as free agents are able to put their own terms into contracts and to make their own provisions for enforcement and so forth. And so you can have those kinds of differences of opinion, but either way, you have economics as a profession is ordered around markets and transactions in some fashion or other. It's a question of who the parties to the transaction are, whether they're privately defined subjects alone, or whether you also have various kinds of political entities that are participating in those transactions. I think that seems to me to be a difference for which you can have a lot of controversy about without the kind of things that we're talking about here, which, I think in that sense that the programs at UCLA and Chicago did not offer any kind of direct challenge to political authority there, unlike the programs, I think, at Virginia. I think the programs at UCLA and Chicago just really weren't interested in those kinds of political constitutional issues. What they were, I think, more reflected was, in one way or another, explaining that markets work better than you think, so therefore let them work more. The Virginia program had that part as well, of course, but it also had a part to it that said that there's strong reasons why political processes lead to excessive control over markets and so forth, which starts to challenge the presumption that the progressive presumption that the political oversees the economic. And so in the progressive presumption, you have a political here and the economic here. And I think the Charlottesville put them on a parallel plane, and I think that was a more threatening kind of thing. Now, whether in that kind of context, I think the Virginia program had perhaps more threat than the other two. But still, I think the question that gets back to David and Sandy's future search has to be, how does that feed into various university administrations? And here, I think you could well imagine that a university administrator, what if a university administrator in one setting faces, whether it's a dean, a provost, or whoever, faces strong antagonism from various other significant important departments with which he or she associates strongly. If the department that registers that negative reaction might have a different kind of fate than one that faces a dean who doesn't care, or one in which the departmental members have close associations and tie-ins and connections with people in other programs. So I think there's a whole kind of culture of universities, because these are all non-profit kinds of organizations for the most part, and I think which leaves much more room for personal relationships and so forth to impinge upon how these things turn out. And but anyway, so I don't have any kind of conclusions to offer about why Virginia, not UCLA and Chicago, but I just felt in terms of the logic of the development as it was proceeding, that it was like one of those sore thumbs standing out that called for some kind of effort to address, and so that's that. Then, public principles. Public principles of public debt. Hey, I wanted to bring this up because, say, the immediate probably thing in my mind that led me to address this was Roger Congleton's request that I give a short paper on Buchanan's public debt work for this conference in the end of September, so I thought I could use this as an opportunity to think about that. But as I started thinking about that, I realized that I think the Public Principles of Public Debt is a much more foundational book than has been pitched as being, because it's been pitched as being a statement that borrowing is a means of transferring costs of public activity forward in time. Now, when the book was published, the book, for instance, was published by Richard Early, which published all of those American Economic Association reprints and so on and so forth, the Wall book as well and so forth. So it was this wasn't supported by the EEA, but it had perhaps a kind of association with it. I mean, that publisher that maybe inspired a greater amount of negative reaction, perhaps, but it did inspire a lot of people saying that rebuttals that this wasn't so, because I think it was mistakenly thought that it conflicted with, like, take the Employment Act of 1946 again, that if public debt is then this means of transferring costs from people present to people in the future, does that argue against some kind of use of fiscal policy such as was countenanced in the Employment Act of 46? I think a number of people in that debate, presumed it would, and felt a need to deny the claims. And so I think that was sufficient, certainly, to create a controversy around the book, as it did. But what I think was really significant about that book is not this claim at all, but is the fact that it's a reflection of, like something Pete mentioned this morning in the session, it's a reflection of Buchanan's contractual approach to the organization of government. That Buchanan never did and didn't hear conceptualize government as something that we do to them or for them or whatever, but conceptualize government as something that we all do together, is in an ideal sense of the word. And so, this book was written, in fact, he said he got the inspiration for it while on his trip to Italy, his year in Italy. And in those Italian theorists, the major one is certainly one of my two favorite Italian, or three favorite Italian theorists would have been Antonio da Viti da Marco. And da Viti was interesting in many ways. One was because, of course, he was a long-standing professor of public finance at the University of Rome, but also for a long time he was also a member of the Italian Parliament. And it's clear from some of his correspondence, too, that he thought his theoretical work was not orthogonal to his parliamentary work, but he thought his theoretical work was illuminating, or trying to illuminate, some of the things that went on in Parliament. And he operated with two polar conceptualizations of what he called a monopolistic state and a competitive or cooperative state. And the cooperative state model in the Viti would be the same thing that we recognize as kind of a benefit-driven state, one that reflects collective activities that reflect the interests and preferences of those who are being governed. So it would be basically a scheme of things in which the distinction between masses and elites wouldn't do any work. The mass-elite distinction is a big part of the progressivist distinction. There are people who are governed and the rest are the unwashed masses who must be governed. The Viti cooperative state, the Buchanan sort of framework, is one that says there aren't any superiors out there. They may think they are, but there aren't. And that how to construct a theory of public finance in that framework was something that was on Buchanan's mind from his 1949 paper going forward. It was something he got a big dose of furthermore in his work in Italy. And then I think the public debt book then means that if within that contractual framework, it would say something like, debt might be okay if the people who agree to the debt also agree to take on its liabilities. So you could have a system of debt contract where people agree for some borrowing operation, but at the time of that very agreement, there's also an imposition of personal liabilities for future repayment. And that would be a scheme of public debt that would reflect this Buchanan type, the Viti type of Italianate sort of intuition. And so that, so I think the public principles was much more than a macro theory kind of project about public debt, and was really very much a consensual governance kind of project that happened to have this macro kind of piece to it. And so that's why, I think the public principles of public debt is a much more significant work than that in terms of how it would be located. Nima?
I just want to bring up my point here since you mentioned Jim always had this, at least from what I got from him, on the public choice perspective and the constitutional political economy perspective, was that he thought that this was very much tied to the American experience, and that it may not be as extendable and applicable to outside that experience. And that this the relationship between not just the elites and the masses of the state and the masses, but also how the masses, the individual citizens perceive their relationship with each other and the state. And I don't know if that I've never had a clear sense of what to make of that.
No, well, but no, he very clearly what they were trying to do is say, well, let's take, especially Madison's part of the Federalist Papers and the constitutional structure, and say it made sense in terms of basic economizing logic. Say the logic was reflected in Buchanan's cost of choice. It makes sense in that economizing logic if you wanted a system of governance where you, as just a citizen in that arena, wanted to have a feeling not of being dominated, not of relations of domination and subordination, as progressivists have, but wanted to have relationships among equals. And that was very much in that kind of equality and then kind of framework. Now, but I say certainly the formulation was specifically in terms of the American system. You're quite right. What we got here. So the next to last section, then, I want to look forward. So this was a research program that was assembled starting in 1956, had pretty much been assembled by 1958. This next to last section, I want to pose myself the task of how would you express Virginia political economy and the opposition to progressivist political economy in terms of the categories or methodology of scientific research programs, a kind of an orientation that says you take a bunch of scholars who seem to have a lot in common, that there will be certain kinds of principles that govern what they perceive as questions that they don't challenge, but simply are foundations upon which their work is developed. And so there are certain kinds of unchallenged foundations that any kind of scholar has to engage in, because we all have to take some point of departure as given when we go forward in our thinking. And that was characteristic of the Virginia program. I think it's still characteristic of what we call Virginia political economy today. I'm going to project that in the table in a second. And I'm going to compare that then with the bête noire of the Virginia program, which I just label as progressivist political economy, where I try to think of these as two alternative sets of hardcore presumptions that are just not really challenged. They're pretty much given starting points, and your analysis springs from those presumptions for the most part. And so this is the table then. And I'd say these differences, I think of these differences more as foreground and background rather than as absolute kinds of differences. I'm a big believer in foreground and background rather than absolutes. And certainly in this scheme of things, Virginia political economy, say, is a political economy of liberty, is contrasted with the political economy of control. That, of course, fits in with the characterization on the one hand of Ada Lerner's economics of control, which I think can very much serve as a progressivist Bible on economic theory. And on the other hand, with Hayek's constitutional liberty as a different kind of, again, I say foreground and background because I think there's always going to be margins of ambiguity, spreading, and so forth. But I think in the Virginia program, they all, reflected later in the Coast, you all started with presumption that if people are having problems, that there are ways in which they can work things out, whether it be through development of new organizations, new contractual arrangements, and so on and so forth, and the world continually evolves through people engage in these activities and seeing politics more as a last resort, perhaps, rather than as a point of departure. Then I think the second is a very much of a viscerally shared dislike of people who think they're superior or better, was part of Virginia political economy. That no countenance of the notion of people being elite, of subordination, domination relationships, that ideally they're all treated in terms of relationships of equality and so forth. And I remember, as another sidebar, I just moved to Irvine in 1966. And that next year, Irvine was recruiting Buchanan, and he ended up going to UCLA that year instead. And he and Mrs. Buchanan were come over to our house for dinner. And my wife was saying, what do I do with Mr. Buchanan coming? He's so eminent. And I said, oh, like anyone else, he puts his pants on one leg at a time. And so she felt better after that, and everything went swimmingly. But so that sort of equality is kind of a visceral, gut-level sense. It's like an analytical egalitarianism is the foundational core of their thinking. And that then, in turn, leads to different attitudes towards a variety of types of matters. I think a third thing here, a robust civil society with private ordering or law versus anemic civil society dominated by public ordering. I think even Buchanan's theory of clubs, in a way, it's not a theory of public goods, in a way it is, but it's a theory of private ordering and how it can unfold, again, in which people can sense some kind of commonality of problems and seeking to develop organizations to allow them to go forward in productive fashion as they judge themselves, rather than as some outside person judges what should be good for them. And so you can't think of a society in terms of public and private, market and state, public and private goods. That kind of Samuelsonian dichotomy eliminates the whole realm of intermediate institutions, civil society, and so forth. And so they very much, not all of them explicitly thought, but they were certainly very comfortable with a kind of a triangular notion of robust civil societies, of markets and profit-seeking enterprises, of political activity, and the whole variety of associations, clubs, and these kinds of activities in a, you might say, a three-legged characterization of society rather than a bifurcated characterization of society. It was all part of that, which led to things like, if you think about things, new situations, think about whether private ordering can create new configurations and so forth. Fourth, these terms, interacting agents and networks and so forth, weren't in play back then, but that certainly was the way they thought about things. They thought about societies as networks of interacting agents. They didn't think about it as some kind of fields of rulers and masses. That the interacting agents, that you find that in Nutter and the Soviet Union, the Jaeger essays, all those, that kind of schema of, when you think about society, you see in these network fashions, see all kinds of dots and connections and people moving around, creating connections and so forth, and with not some locus of control of the whole scheme. What you don't see is some kind of hierarchical schemata where you have certain kinds of elites at the top who know better, and then you have everyone else. And another, number 5, that's a term I've used, but they were societies as reasonably orderly pedestrian crowds rather than societies as parades that require marshals for the most part.
Sandy.
Yeah, that's right. Perfect.
No, she's reasonably orderly.
And then finally, quit that a process-based analysis with a generative mode of thought. Those terms, again, weren't in play back then, but that's very much the style of thinking that informed their kinds of sensibilities and institutions. Was what you're always talking about is some kind of unfolding developmental kind of process through time rather than some state of existence at some particular time. And I want to close with irony in less than 5 minutes. This is something that I recently, I was aware of and has had for quite some time, Carl Schmitt, but recently I got reinvigorated and re-intrigued by Carl Schmitt. That one of the things I've often wondered about is why Buchanan's never expressed any interest in it. At the same time these Italian political finance guys wrote, there were a bunch of Italian sociologists like Gaetano Mosca, Roberto Mikos, and so forth, and also Pareto, who did some very interesting work in terms of elites, masses, power, ideology, and the governance and so forth, that I think is really fertile territory that I want to explore more myself. And I had a couple of talks with Jim, but he said he just never really cared to investigate that and hadn't really thought about it. But Carl Schmitt, I closed the speculation in the paper. What if Carl Schmitt had been on the Virginia faculty in around 1960? It would have been 72 in 1960. Carl Schmitt was basically a liberal, but he resisted what he felt was the tendency of liberalism to reduce politics to the rule of law, thereby eliminating the political, which he thought was an uneliminatable feature of human life. That his analysis, for instance, of the collapse of Weimar was very much similar to Walter Euchen's analysis of the collapse of the Weimar Republic, which was a overly weak state that could not resist the predation by various kinds of interest groups that undermined it. Now, Schmitt referred to things like we need a strong state to keep economic freedom was one of his mantras. Now, the problem with that strong state stuff, as I see it, is no one knows how to do it. But still, I'm intrigued by Schmitt's notion of there's a notion of the political that is autonomous. It can't be eliminated. And that may be, I think it probably resides in human nature, perhaps ultimately. It's perhaps a problem of how to deal with the beast when you can't slay the beast, but you have to live with it in some fashion. And Schmitt referred to, Schmitt and Hayek, I think, were really very close, except Schmitt had a 3-year or so Nazi period, although before that he tried to get Hindenburg to kick out all the Nazis and communists, and Hindenburg said our Constitution didn't allow it, and Schmitt said that's when the Constitution needs to be worked around to get rid of it. It's a problem of how liberalism can defend itself in a way that Schmitt was working with. Schmitt referred to things like hyperactive legislators and stuff like that. He has this term, excuse my German, because I had to pass reading exams in German and so forth, but didn't have to speak it. But he used this term in one of his books, motorisier Gesetzgeber, or turbocharged legislator, is how I would translate something like that. And so he had the same kind of liberal concerns, but yet had the sense that the political was there because there's more to life than normality. And his sense was that liberalism was good for normality, but life wasn't always just normal. There was always exceptions. Moreover, the political itself will create exceptions. And I read, when I was reading some of the stuff by Schmitt lately, I find myself, this is really interesting, but I haven't figured out what to do with it yet. Maybe in a future time I will, but I haven't figured out what to do with it, but I think it's really important stuff, and I think I'll close with that.